We entered the woods at noon. The trail was one we had taken 100 times before, but that day the air felt different. Too heavy, too still. Even the birds seemed to vanish once we stepped past the first line of trees. There were 4 of us, me, Claire, Mark, and Jonah. We were friends since childhood, bonded by summers spent exploring these very woods. But something about the forest felt older that day, ancient, as if it had been waiting. The sunlight above seemed wrong. It cut through the branches like sharp glass, fractured into strange angles that shimmered against the ground. The more we walked, the less it felt like noon. It was still bright, yet every shadow stretched too long, bending like claws. "Probably the heat," Jonah said, trying to keep the mood light. Nobody laughed. When we checked our phones, we realized something was off. All 4 screens froze on the same time, 12:07 p.m. No battery drain, no signal, just a clock that refused to move. We tried brushing it off, but unease clung to us like a second skin. With each step deeper into the woods, the silence pressed harder, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Claire paused, tilting her head. "Did you hear that?" We listened. Nothing. Yet her expression didn't change. She insisted someone had whispered her name. Mark shook his head. "You're spooking yourself." But I noticed his hands tremble when he adjusted his backpack straps. The further we walked, the more wrong everything felt. The air grew cooler, the path stretched longer, and the woods began to close in. We thought it was just another hike, but time had already stopped for us. By the time we reached the stream, the world no longer felt familiar. The water should have been rushing like always, but it moved too slowly, almost as though it were thick syrup instead of liquid. When Jonah tossed in a pebble, it sank without ripples, vanishing straight down into the dark. Claire refused to cross it. She stood at the edge, her face pale, staring at her own reflection. "It blinked," she whispered. "I swear I just saw it blink." Mark snapped at her, trying to keep control. "It's your nerves. Nothing's wrong here." His voice was firm, but when he leaned to drink, the reflection staring back wasn't his. It was older, lined, gray, hollow-eyed. He jerked back so fast he nearly slipped into the stream. We pressed on in silence after that. The woods grew stranger with every step. The bark of the trees wasn't rough anymore. It had smoothed, polished, as if sanded down by centuries of unseen hands. Their branches twisted in impossible spirals that reached for the sky like frozen lightning. Jonah tried to make a joke about us stepping into a fantasy novel, but even he couldn't force a laugh. He kept rubbing at the lantern he had found earlier, a rusted thing buried half in the dirt. The moment he lifted it, a flame flickered to life inside, glowing weakly without wick or oil. He carried it anyway. Something about its glow felt safe, though none of us would admit why. We thought turning back would be easy. We marked the trail, stacked stones, broke branches. Yet when we tried to retrace our steps, nothing lined up. Our marks vanished. The broken branches looked untouched. It was as though the forest had healed itself, erasing any sign of us. And in the distance, I could have sworn I saw someone walking between the trees. We decided to push deeper, convinced the forest must open back onto the ridge somewhere. Yet with every step, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though the woods were swallowing sound itself. I tried to mark the time again. My phone still glowed 12:07 p.m., the numbers frozen in place. Jonah tapped his screen until his finger hurt, but the clock refused to move. Mark muttered under his breath, "This isn't right." He tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked, betraying the truth. The path began to warp. Sometimes it curved when it shouldn't. Sometimes the ground stretched longer than our eyes could follow. We would walk for minutes only to realize we were still standing beside the same crooked oak. Then Claire stopped walking. Her eyes locked on something ahead. "What is it?" I asked. "There," she whispered, pointing between 2 massive trunks. I followed her gaze and froze. Someone was standing in the distance. It wasn't possible. No one ever hiked this deep. Yet there it was. A tall figure, unmoving, its outline dark against the fractured sunlight. "Hey!" Jonah called out, raising his hand. But the figure didn't respond. It just tilted its head, almost curious. We started toward it, desperate for another human being. But the closer we tried to get, the further it seemed to drift away. With each step, it slid back into the trees, always just beyond reach, always watching. Finally, it vanished. No movement, no sound. Just gone. We stood in silence, breathless, staring at the empty space. That was when the lantern in Jonah's hand flared brighter, as if warning us. The flame swayed violently without wind, casting long shadows that stretched across the trees. And in those shadows, I thought I saw more figures, standing still, waiting. We weren't alone in that forest. We didn't speak for a long while after the shadow vanished. The silence in the woods pressed down on us, thick enough to choke. Even the sound of our own footsteps felt muffled, like we were walking inside someone else's dream. Jonah gripped the lantern tighter. The flame inside flickered, brighter than before, spilling light across the twisted trees. The glow made me realize something strange. The shadows around us weren't falling the way they should. They stretched in the wrong directions, curving away from the flame as though repelled by it. Mark finally snapped. "We need to get out of here. Now, doesn't matter how. We just pick a direction and move." His voice was harsh, but his hands trembled at his sides. We agreed. We had no other choice. So we walked, faster this time, almost running. The ground beneath us seemed to resist, dragging at our legs as though the soil itself was reluctant to let us leave. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, carried on the air like rustling leaves. But soon they grew clearer, too clear. They weren't random noises. They were words. My name spoken over and over again. Then Claire's. Then Mark's. Then Jonah's. Claire clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head. "Stop it. Just stop it." But no one was speaking. The voices were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. When I turned toward the sound, I saw them again. Figures between the trees. Dozens this time. Their shapes barely visible, like outlines carved from mist. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They only watched. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they all stepped back, sinking into the trunks of the trees as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The whispers died. Silence returned. But Jonah's lantern didn't calm. The flame roared higher, casting light across the woods. And in that glow, we realized the path we had been following was gone. We were standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded on all sides by trees we did not recognize. The trail had vanished. No broken branches, no stacked stones, no sign we had ever walked there at all. It was as if the forest had swallowed every trace of us. Mark cursed under his breath. He spun in a circle, searching for landmarks, but every tree looked the same. Smooth, polished, spiraled upward into a canopy that blotted out the sky. There was no sun anymore, only a pale gray glow that gave no sense of direction. Jonah raised the lantern higher. Its light flickered across the trunks, and for a second I thought I saw carvings. Not words, not symbols, but faces. Countless faces pressed into the wood, their mouths frozen open in silent screams. I blinked and they were gone. Claire stumbled forward, tears streaking her face. "We can't stay here. We'll die here. We have to keep moving." So we walked again, though every step felt heavier, like time itself was dragging against us. The whispers had returned, quieter now, threading through the air like a lullaby. Sometimes I could swear they weren't just calling our names. They were begging, pleading. We reached a clearing. In the center stood something impossible. A clock tower, old, rusted, leaning to one side as though it had stood for centuries. His hands pointed straight at 12, unmoving, frozen just like our phones. Jonah stepped closer, lantern light spilling across its surface. The metal groaned as though reacting to him. For a moment, I thought the clock's hands twitched, trying to move, but caught in some invisible resistance. Claire whispered, "It's the same time. It's always the same time." Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "We're not touching it. We're leaving." But I couldn't stop staring at that tower. It didn't belong here, yet it felt like the heart of the forest, the center of whatever had trapped us. And deep inside my chest, I had the sinking feeling that the clock was waiting for us. The clock tower loomed over us like a monument from another world. Rust streaked down its surface, but the numbers on its face were sharp, clear, unweathered by time. The hands still locked at 12. Jonah whispered, "Maybe this is it. Maybe this is why we're stuck." His fingers tightened around the lantern, the flame inside pulsing brighter as if it agreed. Mark shook his head. "Don't start. We're not touching that thing." But the fear in his voice made it obvious. He believed the tower was watching us too. Claire clutched my arm. "Look!" I followed her gaze upward. Between the gaps in the tower's metal frame, I saw movement. Figures shifting inside the structure, pale outlines against the dark. They moved slowly, endlessly circling the clock's center, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as though bound to its gears. Then the sound began. A faint ticking, not from the clock, but from the forest itself. At first it was soft, but soon it spread everywhere. Tick, 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 echoing from every direction. My chest tightened with every beat. It wasn't marking time forward. Felt like it was winding something down. Jonah stepped closer, hypnotized. The flame in his lantern surged, casting shadows that stretched across the clearing. Those shadows bent wrong, forming tall, thin silhouettes that moved when we didn't. "Stop!" Mark shouted, yanking Jonah back. "We leave it. Now!" But the forest shifted before we could move. Trees groaned like bending bones, leaning in toward the clearing. The path we came from was gone again, swallowed whole. Claire began to sob. "It won't let us out. It wants us here." The ticking grew louder, now thundering like a heartbeat across the earth. My phone, dead for hours, buzzed in my pocket. Pulled it out. The screen still read 12:07 p.m., but this time the numbers trembled, as if struggling to change. And for the first time, I wondered if the clock wasn't broken at all. Maybe it was holding something back, something waiting to be released. The ticking filled everything. It wasn't just sound. It was vibration, rattling through the ground, shaking in my bones. Claire clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. Mark kept shouting that we had to move, but there was nowhere left to go. The trees had closed in tighter, their trunks bending inward like bars of a cage. The clearing was now a prison, and at its center the clock tower groaned as if waking from a long sleep. Jonah staggered forward despite Mark's grip. The lantern in his hand blazed, its tiny flame now a roaring fire behind glass. Shadows bent and stretched across the clearing, and in them, figures appeared again. Dozens of them, hundreds, watching us from the edges, their eyes glowing faintly, their mouths moving in silent unison. "Do you hear it?" Jonah whispered, his voice broken. "It's not ticking down. It's ticking for us." Then it happened. For the first time, the clock's hands moved. They shuddered violently, scraping forward a single second past 12. The sound of the gears grinding echoed like thunder, so loud it forced us to our knees. Claire screamed, clutching her head, as the whispers roared back. No longer faint, but deafening. Names, all of our names, screamed over and over, until it felt like the forest itself was calling us. Mark dragged Jonah back from the tower, shaking him. "We're leaving. I don't care how we run." But Jonah's eyes were locked on the flame, wild and distant. "No, it's the only way. The lantern's tied to it. It's the key." The figures in the shadows leaned closer, their faces stretching long and distorted. They weren't just watching now, they were waiting. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. The forest hadn't frozen time. It had trapped us inside of it. And the clock was finally starting again. The clock's grinding echoed across the forest like a scream. The hands twitched again, moving forward another second, and the shadows around us convulsed. Faces leaned from the trees, mouths stretched wide, eyes fixed on us as though we were the offering they had been promised. Claire cried out, "We'll never get out. We're stuck here forever." Her voice broke in the chaos, But Jonah's burned with something different. Conviction. He held the lantern high, its fire raging brighter than ever, no longer bound by glass. The light seared the clearing, and for an instant, the shadows recoiled. "It wants the lantern," Jonah gasped. "It's bound to the clock. If I give it back, maybe—" Mark lunged at him, shaking his head violently. "No, don't you get it? That thing feeds on us. You hand it over, and we're gone." The tower groaned again. The hands lurched forward. 3 seconds past 12 now. With each movement, the air around us grew colder, thicker, harder to breathe. I felt my chest tighten, like the forest was sucking the life from us. Jonah's eyes locked on mine. This is the only way. Before we could stop him, he ran straight to the tower. The shadows surged, reaching for him with claw-like shapes, but the lantern's fire kept them at bay. He pressed the lantern against the base of the clock, and the moment the flame touched the metal, everything froze. Silence. Stillness. The shadows vanished. The ticking stopped. Then, with a sound like 1,000 bells tolling at once, the clock's hands spun violently forward. 12 hours, 12 days, 12 years. Time rushing in a blur so fast I thought my body might rip apart. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, we were standing on the edge of town. The forest was gone. Nothing left but a barren field of dead stumps. The town was still there, but changed. The streets cracked, buildings collapsed, faces older, unfamiliar. People stared at us with disbelief and fear. Claire gasped when she saw her mother, wrinkled, gray, trembling. "Claire," she whispered, "you vanished 20 years ago. We hadn't aged a day, but the world had. And at night, when the wind is still, I swear I hear ticking again. The forest where time stopped may be gone, but it is still waiting for us."